The quilt stopped him cold in the middle of the dusty street, the way a ghost might stop a man who had long since made peace with the dead. It was a Tuesday in late September of 1882, and the town of Caldera Springs, New Mexico Territory, was humming with its usual weekday business. Wagons rolled through mud dried hard as iron after last week's rain. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady intervals from the far end of the main street. A dog barked somewhere behind the general store, and a pair of old men on the saloon porch argued about cattle prices in the slow, comfortable way that men argue when they have nothing better to do. Jesse Cole had ridden into town for flour, salt, and a new length of rope, which were three things a working ranch always needed and never seemed to have enough of. He had no intention of stopping at the market tables set up along the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, where townswomen and traveling vendors spread their wares every Tuesday and Thursday to supplement whatever the general store carried. But then he saw the quilt. It was folded over a wooden rack that a young woman had constructed from two sawhorses and a broomstick, and even folded as it was, Jesse recognized it the way a man recognizes his own name written in someone else's handwriting. The pattern was called Cathedral Windows, and it was achingly precise, every hexagonal pane of fabric cut with the kind of obsessive care that most people reserved for things they were trying not to lose. The colors were particular, too. Deep burgundy, the color of old wine, paired with a gold that wasn't quite yellow and wasn't quite brown, and threaded through the whole design was a narrow strip of pale blue that his mother had always called sky in winter blue, as though the color itself needed a story to explain it. His mother had called the quilt her best work, and she had made it in the winter of 1871, when Jesse was 14 years old, and the Texas wind outside their small ranch house in Brewster County had been so cold it had sounded like something alive pressing against the shutters. He could see her in his mind's eye right now, sitting by the fire with her needle and her thread, humming something tuneless, stopping occasionally to hold a pane of fabric up to the lamplight to check whether the seam lay flat. She had given the quilt to his older brother Caleb when Caleb married, back in 1874. And then Caleb had died in the summer of 1876, thrown from a horse during a cattle drive, and Jesse had assumed the quilt had stayed wherever Caleb's widow had gone after she sold the property and moved back east. Yet here it was, folded over a broomstick in Caldera Springs, New Mexico, 11 years after his mother had sewn the last stitch and 6 years after his brother had died, and Jesse Cole stood in the middle of the street with his flour money in his coat pocket, and his heart doing something complicated inside his chest. The young woman standing beside the rack had not yet noticed him staring. She was arranging a row of smaller items on a folding table to her left, her attention entirely absorbed in the task. She was perhaps 23 or 24 years old, with dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable weather, and she moved with the quick, efficient grace of someone who had been setting up and breaking down market tables for a long time. Her dress was clean but plain, a practical dove-gray wool that said she cared about being presentable without caring too much about being fashionable. Her hands were capable-looking, the kind that knew how to work. There was a small smudge of something, ink or perhaps charcoal, on the back of her left hand that she had apparently not noticed. Jesse crossed the street without fully deciding to do it. He stopped at the edge of the table and looked at the quilt more closely, and the closer he looked the more certain he became. His mother had embroidered her initials into the corner of every quilt she ever made, a small MC in thread the same shade as the backing fabric, subtle enough that you had to know to look for it. He stepped around the rack and lifted the corner of the folded quilt, and there it was, MC Margaret Cole. His mother's hand had made those two tiny letters, and seeing them was like hearing her voice come out of a room where no one was standing. "Are you interested in the quilt?" He turned. The young woman had come around the table and was watching him with careful eyes that were very dark, almost black, the kind of eyes that were good at reading people and had clearly been doing it for a long time. Up close she had a small scar along her jawline, old and faded, and a directness in her expression that he found immediately refreshing. "Where did you get this?" he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. She did not flinch. "It came into my possession through an estate sale." "Is there a problem?" "No problem," he said. He took his hat off, which was the kind of reflex that his mother had drilled into him before he was old enough to argue about it, and he turned the hat in his hands. "My name is Jesse Cole. I believe this quilt was made by my mother." Something shifted in her expression. The businesslike guardedness softened a degree, replaced by something that might have been surprise or might have been caution. "Your mother," she repeated. "Margaret Cole. She embroidered her initials in the corner of every quilt she ever made. MC, you can see them there, bottom left corner, in thread that matches the backing." The young woman looked at the corner he indicated, then looked back at him. "She made this in the winter of 1871. I was 14. I watched her do it." He paused. "She passed in 1879, consumption." A brief silence settled between them, the kind that follows the mention of someone recently enough gone that the grief still has edges. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. He could tell she meant it because she didn't follow it up with anything else. She just let the apology stand on its own, which was the right thing to do. "I'm not asking you to give it up," he said quickly. "I know you paid for it. I just needed to know if I was right." He put his hat back on. "My brother had it last. I never expected to see it again." "Your brother, Caleb, he passed in 1876. The young woman looked at the quilt again, and the expression on her face was one he couldn't quite read. It was something tender and something careful at the same time. "I bought it from an estate sale in Socorro last spring," she said. "A woman named Harriet Prentice. She was selling off a house full of things. I don't know where she got it." Jesse nodded slowly. He could piece together most of it. Caleb's widow, whose name had been Clara, had had a sister who married a Prentice. He remembered hearing about it at the time. Clara must have passed the quilt along to her sister, and the sister had eventually ended up in Socorro, and the quilt had traveled with her and been sold when she died. Quilts moved through families and out of them. That was the way of things. "I'd like to buy it from you," he said. "Whatever you paid, I'll match it." She looked at him steadily. "I paid $3 for it. I'll give you 5. She shook her head slowly, and he braced himself for a negotiation, but what she said surprised him. "I'm not sure I want to sell it to you for money," she said. "If it belongs to your family's story, that's a different thing than a commercial transaction." She tilted her head slightly. "But I haven't eaten since yesterday morning, so I'm in no position to be purely sentimental about it." The directness of that statement was so unexpected that Jesse almost laughed. He caught himself. "You haven't eaten since yesterday morning. The road from Socorro is longer than I remembered, and I miscalculated my provisions." She said it with a flat practicality that made it clear she was not looking for sympathy, only for honesty. Jesse looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the table of goods she was selling, which included several smaller quilted items, a collection of hand-painted ceramic tiles that looked southwestern in origin, 2 pairs of leather gloves, and a carved wooden box. She had traveled a long way with a market table's worth of goods, apparently alone, and she had not eaten since yesterday. "Come have a meal with me at the boarding house," he said. "Mrs. Alvarez serves lunch until 2. After that we can settle the matter of the quilt however seems fair." She looked at him for a long moment with those direct dark eyes, measuring something. "I can't leave my table unattended. Is there anyone you trust in the market?" She glanced down the row of vendors, and her gaze settled on an older woman 3 tables down who was selling dried herbs and pickled goods. "Dollar's Rays," she said, almost to herself. "We traveled the last 10 miles together this morning. She might watch it. Then ask her." The young woman looked back at him with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and suspicion. "You're very direct, Mr. Cole." "So are you, Miss Vasquez," she said. "Elena Vasquez. Miss Vasquez. The boarding house is across the street and 1 building north. I'll wait for you there if you want to ask Mrs. Rays." She considered him for another moment. Then she nodded once, with the manner of a woman who had made a decision and did not intend to second-guess it, and she walked the 3 tables down to where the older woman sat on a folding stool. Jessie watched her explain the situation in quick, quiet Spanish, watched the older woman nod and wave her hand in a generous, don't worry about it gesture, and watched Elena Vasquez come back with something that might, on a different woman's face, have been called a relieved smile. The boarding house run by Maria Alvarez was the best establishment in Caldera Springs, which was not saying a great deal, but it was warm and it smelled of good food, and the tablecloths were changed every other day. Mrs. Alvarez was a large, energetic woman in her 50s who ran her dining room the way generals ran campaigns, and she set plates in front of Jessie and Elena without asking them what they wanted because she never asked anyone what they wanted. She decided what they needed and she brought it, and she was right about 90% of the time. What she brought was a thick stew of beef and chili and potatoes, a basket of cornbread, and 2 mugs of coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright. Elena Vasquez ate with the focused gratitude of a person who was genuinely hungry and was not going to pretend otherwise. Jessie appreciated that. He had spent enough time around people who performed indifference toward food as a social affectation, and it had always struck him as dishonest. "Tell me about your mother," Elena said, when she had taken the edge off her hunger and could afford to look up from her plate. "The woman who made the quilt." Jessie wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "She was from Missouri originally. Came west with my father in 1860 before the war. She was a quilter the way some people are musicians." It was the language she thought in. He paused. She kept a pattern book, little sketches of every design she ever wanted to try. She had maybe 200 patterns in that book, and she made perhaps 40 of them in her lifetime. Elena was watching him with an expression of genuine interest. "What happened to the pattern book?" "I have it," he said. "It's in a cedar box on the shelf above my bed. I've had it since she passed." Elena nodded slowly. She broke a piece of cornbread in half and was quiet for a moment. "My mother was a seamstress," she said. "Not quilts, clothing." She could look at a garment and reproduce it from memory. She used to say that fabric has a conversation with the person who cuts it, and if you listen carefully, it tells you where it wants to go. Jessie smiled. "My mother would have liked that." "She passed too," Elena said. 4 years ago, my father the year before that. "I'm sorry." "It's the way of things," she said, which was what people said when they had made their peace with something but not quite finished grieving it. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, the sounds of Caldera Springs went on about their business. A freight wagon creaked past the window. 2 men on horses discussed something at the far end of the street with the particular animated gesturing of a disagreement about directions. "Where are you living now?" Jessie asked. "Nowhere at the moment. I've been traveling since March." She said it without self-pity. "I had a room in Socorro, but the landlord sold the building in August and I've been on the road since. I travel to markets, sell what I make, and look for the next place." "What do you make?" "The tiles you saw on the table, I paint them, and I do some quilted work, smaller pieces, piecework for whatever orders I can find." She looked at him steadily. "It's a living, not a comfortable one, but a living." Jessie thought about the quilt on the rack outside. He thought about how his mother had spent an entire winter on it, hour after careful hour, and how it had moved through the hands of people who had not known what it was, until it had arrived at a market table in a New Mexico Territory town in September of 1882, where a woman who had not eaten since yesterday morning was selling it to make ends meet. Life was full of the most extraordinary coincidences, and most of them made no sense unless you had enough distance to see the whole shape of the thing. "How much do you need," he said, "to set yourself up somewhere stable for the winter?" She looked at him sharply. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Cole. I know you're not. I asked you a question." She put down her fork. "Why?" "Because you're selling my mother's quilt to survive, and that sits wrong with me, and because you seem like someone worth helping." Elena Vasquez studied him with an expression that was careful and complicated. "You don't know anything about me." I know you've been traveling since March. I know you haven't eaten since yesterday. I know you speak Spanish and English with equal ease, which means you grew up in a household where both mattered. I know you asked an older woman's help before accepting a stranger's invitation to lunch, which shows good sense. And I know that you told me you were hungry instead of pretending you weren't, which shows honesty. He paused. That's not nothing. For a moment, something moved across her face that was not quite emotion and not quite not emotion. Then she looked down at her coffee mug. I need about $40 to cover a month's rent, food, and materials to work through the winter. I'll give you the $40 and you keep the quilt, he said. Mr. Cole, I have a ranch 12 miles north of here. 340 acres. I run cattle and I have a small operation that keeps me comfortable enough. He met her eyes. $40 doesn't ruin me, and my mother made that quilt. The silence that followed was not an uncomfortable one. Elena looked at him for a long time and Jesse looked back, and something in the air between them shifted slightly, like the angle of light in the late afternoon when the sun begins its descent in earnest. Why are you being kind to me? She said at last. It was a genuine question, not a suspicious one. My mother would have wanted someone to be, he said. She was that kind of person. Elena looked down again. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, and he understood that she was a woman who did not cry easily and was presently doing a considerable amount of work not to. I'll accept the $40, she said quietly. And I'd like you to have the quilt. I can't sell it knowing what it is. Jesse shook his head. Keep it. You need it more than I do. I have my mother's pattern book. That's enough. They finished their meal. Mrs. Alvarez brought coffee refills without being asked, assessed the two of them with her experienced eye in the manner of a woman who had been watching the beginning stages of things for many years, and said nothing except to recommend the apple cake she had made that morning. They had the apple cake. Elena asked him about the ranch, and he told her about it, more than he had intended to. He told her how he had come to New Mexico in 1878, after his mother passed, because Texas had stopped feeling like home, and he needed to be somewhere that didn't carry so many memories in every fence post and field. He told her about building the ranch house himself with 2 hired hands, and how it had taken the better part of a year. He told her about the cattle and the land, and the way the light came over the mesa in the morning, and turned everything briefly gold. She listened the way good listeners listen, which is without preparing their next remark while the other person is still talking. In turn, he asked about her life, and she told him she had grown up in the territory, her father a craftsman of Spanish and Mexican heritage who had made furniture, her mother the seamstress. She was the youngest of 4 children, the only one still in the territory. Her brothers had gone to California, her sister had married and moved to Colorado. She had stayed because she didn't know how not to love the particular light of New Mexico, the particular color of its sky, the way the mountains sat on the horizon like old men who had seen everything and were not impressed by any of it. By the time they walked back to her market table together, it was past 2 o'clock, and the afternoon light was beginning to go amber. Dollar's Rays reported that 2 people had stopped to look at the tiles, but neither had bought anything. Elena sold 2 tiles and a pair of gloves before the market wound down at 4. Jesse stayed, partly because he had not yet bought his flour and salt and rope, and partly because he found himself unwilling to simply ride away. He sat on the edge of the boardwalk and talked with Dollar's Rays while Elena managed her table, and he learned from Dollar's that Elena had been traveling alone since August, that she was the most capable young woman Dollar's had ever met, and that she deserved better than she had been given by life so far, a sentiment Dollar's delivered with the directness of a woman who said exactly what she thought and did not worry about whether you agreed. When the market closed, Jessie went with Elena to the livery stable where she kept her horse and the small flatbed cart she used to transport her goods. The horse was a stocky gray mare named Paloma, and she was well cared for, her coat brushed and her feet clean, which told Jessie something about Elena's character, because a person's horse always tells you something about their character. "Where are you camping tonight?" he asked. There's a grove about a mile east of town. I stayed there on the way in." She began unhitching Paloma with practiced hands. Jesse thought for a moment. He thought about the road, about a woman alone in a tent in September when the nights were already turning cold, and about $40 and the right thing to do. "Mrs. Alvarez rents rooms," he said. "She charges reasonable rates." Elena glanced at him. "You've already bought me a meal, Mr. Cole. I know. You can't just keep solving my problems." "Not solving," he said, "suggesting. Whether you take the suggestion is up to you." She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression was the complicated mix of pride and pragmatism that he was already beginning to recognize as distinctly Elena Vasquez. "One night," she said finally. "I'll spend one night at the boarding house and then I'll find a situation." "That's all I'm suggesting," he said. He paid Mrs. Alvarez for a week's room without telling Elena, because he knew she would argue, and because Mrs. Alvarez, who had been sizing up the situation all afternoon with her general's eye, agreed to the discretion with a small, satisfied smile. Jesse rode home that night with his flour and his salt and his rope, and the memory of dark eyes that looked at things straight on. He told himself that was all it was, a good deed, the right thing in honor of his mother. He told himself that for approximately 3 days, during which time he found reasons to be in town on 2 of those days, and found Elena Vasquez at the market table on both occasions, and lingered longer than a man purchasing flour strictly needed to linger. She was selling more tiles. She had a small commission, she told him on the second visit, from the owner of the hotel, who wanted a set of painted tiles for the lobby fireplace surround. It was good work, steady and well paid, and her eyes were bright when she talked about it. She had started a new painted piece that morning, working from memory on the particular shape of the mountains she could see from her window at Mrs. Alvarez's boarding house. "You have a good situation here," he said. "For now," she agreed. "I've been thinking about looking for a more permanent workshop space, somewhere with good light and room to work." "What kind of space?" "Not large. One room with a good north window if possible. The north light doesn't change much through the day. It's the best for painting." Jesse nodded. He was thinking about the small stone building on his property that he used for storage, the one with the large north-facing window that had been there when he bought the land, originally built as a smokehouse and converted for various purposes since. It had good walls and a sound roof, and the window was very large, which was why it made a poor smokehouse and a poor general storage space, because the light came in and spoiled certain things. He did not say anything about it that day. He went home and thought about it for the better part of the evening, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, while the stars came out over the mesa with that particular extravagance they reserved for clear September nights in the high desert. He was 35 years old. He had lived alone on this ranch for 4 years, and before that had lived alone in a series of other places. He was not, by disposition, a solitary man. He liked conversation and company. He liked the way a house felt different when there were 2 people in it, the way sound moved differently, the way meals tasted better when they were shared. He had simply not, in the years since his mother's death and his brother's death and the general erosion of everything familiar, found someone he could imagine sharing the particular quiet of his particular life with. He thought about Elena Vasquez's eyes, the directness of them. He thought about the way she had said she hadn't eaten since yesterday without any drama or self-pity. He thought about what she had said about the mountains sitting on the horizon like old men who had seen everything. He thought about the quilt, his mother's quilt, and how it had traveled all those years and all those miles and ended up here. He was not a superstitious man, but he was not an entirely unsuperstitious man either. The next morning he rode into town early. Elena was at breakfast at Mrs. Alvarez's table when he arrived. She looked up at him with an expression of wary recognition, as though she was already familiar with the fact that when Jesse Cole showed up somewhere, he was generally about to suggest something. "I have a building on my property," he said, sitting down across from her at Mrs. Alvarez's insistence and accepting a cup of coffee. It's one room, stone walls, sound roof. Large north window. I use it for storage, but there's nothing in it that can't be moved. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. If you want a workshop for the winter, I'm offering the use of it. No charge. Elena set down her coffee cup. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Cole, I know what you're going to say. Do you? You're going to say you can't accept it. I was going to say, she said carefully, that it would not be appropriate for me to take a room on a single man's property and that any reasonable person would understand why. He had thought about this. The building is completely separate from the house. 100 yards at least, and Mrs. Alvarez is my nearest neighbor about a mile down the road. You could stay here and use the building during the day. He paused. Or you could find another arrangement altogether, and I'll understand that too. Elena looked at her breakfast plate. She was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then she said, would I have full use of the building to come and go as I need? Yes. And you wouldn't expect anything in return? No, he said. Then, after a moment, he added, though I'd welcome someone to have supper with on occasion if the mood ever struck you. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile but in the direction of one. Supper, she said, just supper. Mrs. Alvarez can confirm that I am a tolerable cook when motivated. Mrs. Alvarez, who had been listening without any pretense of not listening, called from the kitchen that he was better than tolerable and that his green chili stew was the best she had tried outside of her own kitchen, and she didn't say that lightly. Elena looked toward the kitchen door. Then she looked back at Jessie. The not-quite smile completed itself, briefly and privately, before she composed her expression again. I'll try the arrangement for 2 weeks, she said. And I'll pay you something for the space once the hotel commission is finished. You don't have to. I'm not accepting charity, Mr. Cole, she said, with a quiet firmness that he recognized by now as entirely non-negotiable. I'm accepting reasonable terms. There's a difference, and I know the difference. He nodded. Fair enough. 2 days later, Jessie spent the better part of a morning moving his miscellaneous stored goods out of the stone building, sweeping it thoroughly, and repairing a small gap in the window frame where the wind had been getting in. He borrowed a table from Mrs. Alvarez and added 2 sturdy shelves along one wall and a good iron hook by the door for a lantern. He did not add anything more, because it was not his space to decorate. Elena arrived with Paloma and the flatbed cart loaded with her paints, her tiles, her materials. She walked into the building and stood in the middle of it for a moment, looking at the north window where the morning light was coming in clean and even, and her face did something complicated and private that Jessie was careful not to witness too closely. It's perfect, she said, and her voice was steady but thin around the edges. It needs a better latch on the door, he said, because that was practical and practical was easier than the alternative. I'll fix it this afternoon. She turned and looked at him directly. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Jessie, he said, we've had lunch and supper and a week's worth of conversation. I think you can use my first name. That earned him a real smile, the first full one he had seen from her, and it was considerable. It changed the whole geometry of her face, opened it up, made it luminous. Jessie Cole, who had not been struck by anything very profoundly in some time, was struck by it rather profoundly, and he put his hands in his pockets and looked at the latch on the door and thought about what he needed to fix it. That was October of 1882, and the arrangement that was meant to last 2 weeks lasted considerably longer than that. Elena worked in the stone building 6 days a week. She was methodical and disciplined about it, arriving in the morning and working through until the light changed, which in October happened earlier and earlier each day. She had a natural sense of color that Jessie could see even from a distance, on the occasions when he happened to be working on the fence line that ran along that side of the property, and could glance over and see her moving around inside the light-filled building, tile and brush in hand. She came to supper twice in that first week, both times because he rode into town to give Mrs. Alvarez some fresh beef and happened to encounter Elena on the road back, and both times they ate at his kitchen table and talked until the fire burned low. She told him about her painting, about the way she saw color in layers, the way she mixed her pigments the same way her mother had mixed thread colors for embroidery. He told her about the land, about how the ranch worked through the seasons, about the particular challenges of the high desert in winter when the water sources froze and the cattle needed supplemental feed. There was a comfort to these conversations that surprised him, because comfort was usually something that developed slowly over years, not weeks. But he found himself at ease with her in a way that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with the simple fact that she was someone whose company felt, in some essential and slightly mysterious way, necessary. He was careful with himself about this. He was a 35-year-old man who was prone to directness and disinclined toward self-deception, and he recognized what was happening inside him without exactly knowing what to do about it. Elena Vasquez had come into his life through the extraordinary coincidence of his mother's quilt, and she was here on a practical arrangement and a genuine but uncomplicated friendship, and he was not going to complicate it by allowing his feelings to outpace hers. So he was careful. He was respectful. He fixed the latch on the door and patched the small section of fence that ran nearest her building, and he made sure there was always firewood stacked by the door so that she would be warm if she worked on cold days, and he did not say anything about any of it beyond the practical. Elena, for her part, was careful too. She noticed the firewood and the fence and the way he always seemed to have an extra cup of coffee poured when she stopped at the house for water on her way to or from the building. She said nothing about any of it either, except to thank him for things that required thanks, and to carry on talking about the rest of it as though it were ordinary, which they were both, apparently, very willing to agree it was. The hotel commission was completed in mid-October, and was received with enthusiasm by the hotel owner, a prosperous man named Henderson who commissioned an additional set for his private dining room, and told Elena that if she wanted steady work, he had 3 more buildings that needed decorative tile work. Elena told Jesse about this over supper on the Thursday after Henderson made his offer, and her face was the most open he had seen it, unguarded in the specific way of someone who has received good news after a long stretch of difficult news and is not yet sure how to contain it. "That's the best thing I've heard in some time," Jesse said. "It's more work than I can do alone in the time he wants," she said. "He wants the first set of the new commission by December 1st. She looked at her plate, then back up at him. "I was thinking of advertising for an assistant, someone who can prepare the tiles, do the basic work so I can focus on the painting. Do you know anyone?" "Not yet, but this is a good town for finding people. There are a lot of women here who know craft work." She paused. "Dollars Reyes' granddaughter paints. I've seen her work, it's good. You should talk to her." "I plan to." Elena picked up her coffee cup. "I also wanted to tell you that I'll be able to pay you for the space starting next month." "Henderson is paying well." Jesse started to object and stopped himself, because she had made it clear that the paying was not negotiable and that he had agreed to reasonable terms. "Whatever you think is fair," he said. She named a number that was perhaps slightly above what was fair, which he understood was her way of refusing the charity without making a scene about it, and he accepted it without comment because he understood her well enough by now. In the 3rd week of October, something happened that shifted things in a way that neither of them had anticipated. Jesse had been out since early morning checking the eastern fence line, which ran along a rocky stretch of ground where the posts tended to heave when the temperature swung. He came back in the early afternoon to find a rider at his gate, a man he didn't know, asking after Elena. Jesse did not like the look of this man. He was perhaps 40, well dressed in the way that people dress when they want you to think they have money rather than when they actually have it. He had the manner of someone who expected to be accommodated, and the way he asked after Elena was proprietary in a way that raised the hair on the back of Jesse's neck. "She's not here right now," Jesse said carefully. "Can I ask your business?" "I'm looking for Miss Vasquez. My name is Garrett. I have a business arrangement to discuss with her." Jesse told him to come back later, which Garrett did not like but accepted because Jesse's expression made clear there was no alternative to accepting it. When the man had ridden off down the road, Jesse went to the stone building. Elena was at her work table, a half-finished tile in her hands, and she looked up when he came to the door with an expression that immediately became attentive when she saw his face. "There was a man at my gate asking after you," Jesse said. "Called himself Garrett." The change in Elena's expression was instantaneous and entirely unambiguous. The color left her face and something cold came into her eyes. She set the tile down very carefully. "He found me," she said, and her voice was flat. "You know him. He was my landlord in Socorro." She folded her hands on the table. "When he sold the building in August, he told me I could stay until the end of the year if I was willing to work as his housekeeper without pay. When I refused, he became unpleasant about it." She met Jesse's eyes steadily. "He's been unpleasant for some time. He's the reason I left." Jesse felt something cold and deliberate settle in his chest, which was his particular variety of anger, the kind that did not express itself loudly. "Did he threaten you?" "He threatened my livelihood, told people I owed him money when I didn't, made it difficult for me to find customers." She picked up the tile again and put it down again. "I thought when I left Socorro I'd gotten clear of him." "You have, as far as I'm concerned," Jesse said. "I'll make sure of it." "Jesse." Her voice was careful. "He's not the kind of man you want trouble with. He has friends in certain offices." "I've dealt with that kind before," Jesse said. "He has no claim on you and he has no business on my property. Those are simple facts." Elena looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not, for once, guarded or calculating. It was something more unguarded than that, something that he recognized with a start as the particular way people look when they are not accustomed to being defended and someone has just done it. "You don't need to fight my battles," she said quietly. "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than their usual ones. Jesse was aware that he had just said something that crossed a line, or rather that he had said something true that he had been carefully not saying for 3 weeks, and that the saying of it had changed the air in the room. Elena looked at her work table. "Jesse," she said, and she said his name, not Mr. Cole, which was also a change. "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Are you being kind to me because of the quilt? Because of your mother?" He thought about this honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think. "That's what started it," he said. "Yes. And now," he met her eyes, "now it has very little to do with the quilt." Another silence, this one with a particular quality he had not encountered with her before, something warmer and more uncertain and more honest than their usual careful, comfortable silences. "I don't know what to do with kindness," she said at last, and it was the most unguarded thing he had heard her say. "I've been on my own a long time, and I've learned how to manage on my own, and I've made my peace with that. And then you appeared at my market table and recognized a quilt, and now I'm here and she stopped, started again. "I don't know what this is." "Neither do I," he said. "Exactly, but I don't think that's a problem." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the afternoon light came through the north window and fell across the table between them in that even, unchanging way it had. "I'll let you get back to your work," he said, "and I'll deal with Garrett." "Jesse." He turned at the door. "Be careful," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had told him to be careful, and the fact of it felt significant in a way that was quiet but definite. "Always," he said. Garrett came back the following morning, this time with a companion, a wiry man who rode slightly behind him and said nothing, but had the quality of someone who was meant to say things at strategic moments. Jesse met them at the gate with the particular stillness of a man who has spent years working in country, where things could go wrong quickly, and has learned that stillness is better than agitation in such moments. Garrett made his case, which amounted to a claim that Elena owed him back rent from her time in Socorro, a claim that was constructed with enough plausible detail to sound credible to a casual ear. Jesse listened to all of it without expression and then said, very quietly, that if Garrett had a legal claim, he was welcome to take it to the county court in Las Cruces, which was 40 miles south. And if Garrett did not have a legal claim, then he was not welcome on this property and should not return. Garrett pushed. Jesse did not. He simply looked at the man with the flat, patient look of someone who is very comfortable with silence and not at all comfortable with being moved off a position he has decided on, and eventually Garrett ran out of pushback. "She's just a mestiza with a paint set," Garrett said, with the particular contempt that small men use when they are out of arguments. "You're making a fool of yourself over a nobody." Jesse considered this for a moment. Then he said with perfect evenness, "I'd like you to leave my property now. I won't say it again." Garrett and his companion left. Jesse had no certainty they would stay gone, but he thought they likely would, because Garrett was the kind of man who chose situations where he had a clear advantage, and he had been made to see clearly that this was not one of those situations. He did not mention the contemptuous remark to Elena. There was no reason to repeat the words of a small man. What he did do, the following Saturday, was ride into Las Cruces and speak with a lawyer of his acquaintance about the nature of harassment and what avenues of legal protection existed in the territory. The lawyer, a careful man named Whitfield, confirmed that there were instruments available if needed, and made a note of Elena Vasquez's situation in his ledger in the event that they were required. Jesse came home satisfied that the matter was in hand and told Elena, when she stopped at the house that evening for the water bucket, that he had spoken to a lawyer and that she had options if Garrett returned. He told her this in the manner of reporting a practical piece of news, because that was what it was. Elena stood in his kitchen doorway with the water bucket in her hand and looked at him with an expression that was moving through several different states simultaneously. "You went to Las Cruces," she said. "It's not far. It's 40 miles. "I had other business," he said, which was only partly true. Elena set down the water bucket. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would you show me your mother's pattern book?" He was surprised by the request or by the timing of it. He thought about it for a moment, then went to the shelf above his bed and came back with the cedar box. He set it on the kitchen table and opened it. And there was the book, its cover worn soft with years of handling, the pages inside filled with his mother's careful sketches and notes. Elena sat down at the table without being invited and opened the book with the reverence of someone handling something old and important. She turned the pages slowly, reading the notes, examining the sketches. Her face in the lamplight was entirely absorbed, entirely open. This was what she looked like when she was doing the thing she loved, Jesse realized. This was her real face, the one without the careful guardedness she wore for the world. She was gifted, Elena said softly. She was. She never thought so. That's always the way. Elena turned another page. She stopped at a sketch that was the cathedral windows pattern, his mother's own drawing of the quilt she had made. "There it is," she said, "the original sketch." Jesse looked at it over her shoulder. His mother had written beside it in her small, even hand, "Made for Caleb, winter 1871, best work I've done. The gold is from the curtain fabric from the Missouri house which I've kept all this time. The burgundy is new, but it was right. The skywinter blue was the hardest to find. I'm happy with it." Elena read the note and was quiet for a long moment. "She kept fabric from her home in Missouri all those years," she said. "She did. She brought a trunk of things west with her in 1860, and she was very particular about what went in it." Elena touched the edge of the page lightly with one finger. "That's love," she said, "when you carry something that far because you can't leave it behind." Jesse stood behind her and looked at his mother's handwriting and felt something that was grief and something that was not grief, something warmer and more complicated. "Yes," he said, "I think it is." November came in cold and clear, the kind of cold that was not yet serious but was making its intentions known. The days grew shorter, and the light in the stone building changed its quality, becoming softer and more horizontal in the afternoons. Elena worked through it all, her tile commissions coming along steadily, and she had brought in Dolores Reyes's granddaughter, a quick-handed young woman named Clara who was 17 and exceptionally talented, as her apprentice. Watching Elena with Clara, Jesse saw a quality in her that he had suspected but not confirmed, a patience and generosity in teaching that was evident in the way Clara's work improved week by week under Elena's instruction. Jesse found himself riding into town more than he strictly needed to, and working on the fence nearest the stone building more than the fence strictly needed, and occasionally, entirely accidentally, being at the kitchen table with the coffee already poured when Elena stopped in on her way back at the end of the day. They talked about everything. They talked about art and cattle and the particular politics of the territory, which were complicated in ways that affected Elena more directly than they affected him, because she lived in the space between the territory's Spanish and Anglo populations in a way that required constant navigation. He listened when she talked about this, really listened, without offering solutions that weren't his to offer, because he understood that some things did not need solving, only witnessing. She told him about her father, who had made furniture of extraordinary quality that was rarely valued properly because of the name attached to it. She told him about her brothers, who had gone to California and found work and sent money home until their parents died, and then the money had stopped, not unkindly but inevitably, the way money does when the obligation that generated it no longer exists. She told him about the man she had been engaged to at 20, who had broken the engagement when his family decided he could do better, which was the most polite way anyone had ever said the thing they were actually saying, which was that Elena Vasquez was not considered a suitable match by certain people for reasons that had nothing to do with Elena Vasquez. Jesse's anger at this, when she told him, was a different quality than the cold, deliberate anger he'd felt about Garrett. This one was hotter and more personal, which surprised him with its intensity. He was a fool, Jesse said. He was a coward, Elena said evenly. There's a difference. Both, he said. He was both. Elena looked at him with a slight smile that was tired and amused in equal measure. Let's talk about something else, she said. Tell me about the worst cattle drive you ever had. He told her, and she laughed for the first time with real abandon, and the sound of it filled his kitchen and went out through the window into the cold November air. And Jesse Cole sat across the table from Elena Vasquez and understood that he was thoroughly, irreversibly, and completely in love with her, and that this was not a casual thing or a convenient thing or a matter of proximity and circumstance. It was the real thing, the kind his mother had described in the matter-of-fact way she described important things, as though love were a law of the physical world like gravity, something you didn't argue with or misinterpret, something you simply acknowledged and worked with. The question was what to do about it. He thought about it for the better part of 3 weeks, which was longer than he usually needed to think about things, but this was important enough to deserve the time. He was a direct man, as Elena had observed early on, and he believed that the things worth saying ought to be said plainly. But he also understood that Elena Vasquez had been moving through the world alone and on her own terms for a long time, and that she had been burned by expectations placed on her by other people, and that the last thing he wanted to do was place an expectation on her that she would feel obligated to meet. So he waited. He watched. He paid attention to the small things, the way he always paid attention to small things, because the small things were where the truth lived. She had started leaving her hat on the hook by his kitchen door without asking whether that was all right. She brought him a jar of preserved peaches from Mrs. Alvarez in mid-November, simply because she knew he liked them. She asked his opinion on things, not the way people ask for opinions when they have already decided and want confirmation, but genuinely, with genuine willingness to be changed by the answer. She remembered things he told her. She asked after the colt that had been struggling with a leg injury in early November, and when he told her it had healed up well, Her face did the pleased thing it did when things went right. On the 22nd of November, there was a cold snap that brought the temperature down sharply and set the stone building's small iron stove working harder than it had been. Jessie spent the morning splitting extra wood and stacking it by the building door, and when Elena arrived from town, she stopped and looked at the wood and then looked at him without saying anything, and what was on her face was not the polite thank you she usually offered for practical gestures. It was something more direct than that, something that had given up on being careful about being seen. "Elena," he said. "Jessie," she said at the same moment. A silence, a slightly startled one. "You go," he said. She folded her hands in front of her. She was in her coat, the good wool one she wore for cold days, and her breath was a small cloud in the air between them. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about what this is." His heart was very calm and very loud. "Have you?" "I said I didn't know what to do with kindness," she said. "I think that was partly true, but I think what I was really saying was that I didn't know what to do with you specifically." She met his eyes. "Because you are not just kind. You are also," she paused. And in the pause he could see her being honest with herself in the particular effortful way that honest people are honest when the truth is something they have been resisting. "You are someone I think about considerably more than I think about most things," she finished, which was perhaps not the most poetic confession in the history of the world but was, coming from Elena Vasquez, as unguarded as he had ever seen her. Jessie looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to know what I was about to say?" "Yes. I was going to say that I would very much like to court you, properly, if you're willing." Elena's breath made another small cloud in the air. She was very still. "Court me," she said. "Yes. With every intention," he said quietly. "If things go as I hope they will." She looked at him for a long time. He did not fill the silence because he had learned that Elena Vasquez needed her silences. "I'm not an easy person," she said at last. "I know. I have opinions about things and I don't change them easily. I know that too. And I won't be managed or directed or made to feel small for my background or my situation." "Elena," he met her eyes. "I have known you for 2 months and you have never once been anything but exactly what you are. I'm not asking you to be anything else. I'm asking to spend time with you with the hope that you might want to spend the rest of your life with me." He paused. "That's the whole of it." The morning light was very clear and very cold. Elena stood in it and looked at him, and the thing on her face was not calculation or caution or the practical assessment she wore for most of the world. It was something much simpler and much more fundamental than any of those things. "All right," she said. "Court me then." He smiled. It started in his eyes and worked its way down. "All right," he said. The courtship, as it was conducted by Jessie Cole and Elena Vasquez, bore a certain resemblance to what they had already been doing, except that now they were honest about what it was, which changed it considerably. Jessie came to town on Saturdays and took her to supper at the hotel, where the food was better than anywhere else in Caldera Springs. They went to the Sunday social at the church, because Elena liked the music and Jessie liked watching her like the music. He brought her books from the library box at the general store, and she brought him drawings she had made of the mesa and the mountains, and once, a small painted tile of the view from his kitchen window that she had made without telling him, the particular angle of the land as it stretched toward the horizon, done in colors so accurate they made him stop breathing for a second. He hung it above the kitchen table, which he recognized was the kind of thing a man only does when he has already decided how the rest of his life is going to look. December moved in with its serious cold and its early dark. The Henderson commissions were finished and celebrated by a public presentation at the hotel, where Henderson made a speech about the quality of the work, and several people in the audience came up afterward to ask Elena about commissions of their own. Jessie stood at the edge of the room and watched her field these conversations with the kind of warm competence she brought to everything she actually cared about. And he was proud of her with an uncomplicated fullness that he hadn't expected pride to feel like. She caught his eye across the room during one of these conversations, and gave him a small smile that was entirely private and entirely for him. And he thought he might not survive the next few months without saying something considerably more permanent than the courtship had yet required. On a Sunday in mid-December, they rode out together to the far eastern boundary of his land, where the rock formations created a series of natural arches that were spectacular in the winter light. Elena brought a sketch pad and drew while Jessie sat on a flat rock and drank coffee from a tin he'd brought and watched her work, which was not boring in the least because Elena at work was entirely absorbed and entirely alive, moving and still by turns, her head tilted at angles, her hand moving across the paper with authority. They ate lunch in the shelter of the largest arch, where the wind couldn't reach them and the winter sun collected in the stone warmly. Elena looked out at the land that stretched below them, the pale gold of the winter grass, the dark marks of the cattle moving far off across the plain, the blue mountains on the horizon. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her. She was not looking at him but at the view. "I've been thinking about it," she said, "about what it would mean to stay. I've been moving for a long time, and I told myself it was because there wasn't anywhere worth staying. But I think really it was because I was afraid to want anything that might be taken away." She turned and looked at him with those direct dark eyes. "I'm not afraid of that anymore. Or I am afraid, but I've decided not to let it make my decisions for me." Jessie set down his coffee tin. He turned to face her fully. "Elena, yes. I bought a ring in Las Cruces last week," he said. "I've been carrying it since Thursday, and I've been trying to find the right moment, which I have discovered is a fool's errand because there is no right moment. There's just the moment you stop waiting for the right one." He reached into his coat pocket. "I'd like you to marry me. I'd like to build something here with you that lasts. I'd like to wake up in the same house as you for the rest of my life and have supper with you every night and argue with you about things that matter and not argue about things that don't. And I'd like to do all of that for a very long time." He paused. "I love you. I think I've loved you since you told me you hadn't eaten since yesterday morning and made it sound like a completely reasonable piece of information to volunteer." Elena made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, not the hand with the old ink smudge which had long since faded, but the other one, the one that had the small callus from holding her brush. "That was not romantic," she said, but her voice was entirely undone, warm and rough and real. "No," he agreed, "but it was you." She took a breath. She looked at him with the full force of her real face, the open one, the one without the careful armor. "Yes," she said. "Jessie Cole, yes." He put the ring on her finger. It was a simple thing, a silver band with a small turquoise stone, because he had thought that turquoise was the right choice for a woman who painted the sky of the territory and understood its colors. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him, and she leaned across the space between them and kissed him in the shelter of the rock arch with the winter sun warm on their faces and the mountains blue and permanent on the horizon. They were married in February of 1883 at the small church in Caldera Springs, on a clear day with the sky so blue it seemed too extravagant to be real. Mrs. Alvarez organized the wedding breakfast with the thoroughness she brought to all campaigns. Dolores Reyes brought tamales that were declared by the assembled company to be among the finest ever produced in the territory. Clara, Elena's apprentice, served as her bridesmaid with the solemn pride of someone entrusted with an important honor. The hotel owner Henderson came, and the lawyer Whitfield made the 40-mile trip from Las Cruces, and a dozen ranchers and townspeople who had come to know both Jessie and Elena in the preceding months filled the little church and made it feel both small and full of the best kind of warmth. Elena wore a dress she had made herself, in the winter months before the wedding, a deep burgundy wool with gold trim, the colors of his mother's quilt. Jessie noticed this when she came down the aisle on Dolores Reyes' arm, because Dolores had volunteered for the honor with the authority of a woman who makes herself available for things that matter, and his breath caught in his chest in the way that breath has a way of catching when beauty and meaning arrive together in the same moment. The quilt was folded over the back of the chair in the front pew. Elena had brought it from Mrs. Alvarez's boarding house that morning. When Jesse saw it, he looked at her. "It belongs at the wedding," she said simply. "Your mother should be here somehow." He took her hand and held it very firmly, and they walked forward together toward the minister. And outside the church the February wind blew, and the mountains sat on the horizon in that permanent, unbothered way of mountains. And the sky was the particular shade of blue that Elena would later paint many times and never quite fully capture, because some things are best kept alive by the attempt to hold them rather than the success of the holding. They went home to the ranch together that evening, the two of them and Paloma and Jesse's horse, a solid bay named Ranger, and the flatbed cart loaded with Elena's things, which were no longer the everything she owned but only the art materials, because her personal effects had been gradually and quietly migrating to the ranch house over the preceding 6 weeks in the way that personal effects do when they belong where they are going. The stone building became her proper studio that spring, equipped with a proper work table and additional shelves, and a small pot-bellied stove that Jesse installed in March. When it became clear, the iron stove was not adequate for the serious work she was doing. The commissions increased steadily through the year, and by summer Elena had work enough to keep Clara busy full-time, and had begun teaching a Saturday class for women in Caldera Springs who were interested in the painted tile tradition, which had a long history in the territory that was in danger of being lost. Jesse expanded the herd that spring, taking on 2 additional ranch hands, brothers named Pedro and Luis Montoya, who were capable and good-humored, and who brought their lunches to eat in the shade near Elena's studio most days because, as they cheerfully explained, the company was better there than anywhere else on the property. Elena fed them from whatever was in the kitchen when they came to the house, which was frequently, because she had the habit of cooking too much, a holdover from cooking for a family of 6 and not yet recalibrated for 2. Jesse pointed this out on one of the first evenings of their married life, and she looked at the amount of food on the table, and then looked at him and laughed, full and genuine, and said, "We'll figure it out." And they did, in the specific way that married people figure things out, which involves compromise and negotiation, and the occasional spirited disagreement, and a great deal of the kind of quiet daily contentment that is not dramatic enough to describe, but is the real substance of a life shared. Their first argument, that lasted more than an afternoon, was about money. Elena had received a large commission from a businessman in Santa Fe who wanted an extensive installation of painted tilework for his new house, a prestigious job that would require her to spend 3 weeks in Santa Fe in the spring of 1884. Jesse did not like the idea of her traveling alone, and he said so. Elena pointed out, with the particular patience she reserved for moments when she felt his concern was sliding into something else, that she had been traveling alone for years and was entirely capable of it. "I know you're capable," he said. "I just don't want you to. Those are 2 different things, Jesse. I know they're 2 different things. Then say what you actually mean." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll miss you," he said, considerably. The argument deflated. Elena looked at him with the kind of look that was informed by the full context of knowing someone, all their edges and all their softnesses together. "Come with me," she said. "Bring Luis and Pedro to manage the herd for 3 weeks and come to Santa Fe." He thought about this. "I've never been to Santa Fe. Neither have I properly." So they went to Santa Fe together in April of 1884, and it was, by any measure, extraordinary. The city was older and more complex and more beautiful than Jesse had imagined, its narrow streets and thick-walled buildings, and the particular quality of the light at high altitude. Elena worked on her commission in the mornings and early afternoons, and they explored the city together in the evenings. Eating food he had never tasted and looking at art, he had never seen and talking with people whose lives and histories were utterly different from his own. He came home from Santa Fe with a considerably expanded sense of the world, and a carved wooden santo that Elena had found in a market and pressed into his hands, saying it reminded her of his mother's pattern book. He didn't quite see the connection, but he kept the santo on the shelf above the kitchen table because she had given it to him. In June of 1884, Elena told him she was expecting a child. He was at the kitchen table when she told him, eating breakfast before going out to check the southern pasture, and for a moment he simply sat very still with his fork in his hand. Then he set down the fork and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her with the particular certainty of a man who is holding something that contains the best possible future, and she leaned her head against his chest, and they stood like that in the kitchen for a long time while the morning light came through the window and lay across the floor in long golden shapes. "Are you happy?" she asked, which was not a question she usually needed to ask. "Elena," he said, "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life." She pulled back enough to look at his face. He saw her reading it in the way she read things, thoroughly and without hurry. Then she nodded, satisfied, and went back to making breakfast. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, and Elena was thoroughly practical about it, continuing to work in her studio until well into the winter months, adapting her working position and methods as needed. Mrs. Alvarez came out from town regularly, partly to check on Elena, and partly because Mrs. Alvarez had declared herself emotionally invested in the situation and intended to see it through, and who was going to argue with Mrs. Alvarez. On a cold morning in February of 1885, almost exactly 2 years after their wedding, their son was born. Jessie was there for all of it, which was not the universal custom of the time, but was not negotiable as far as Jessie was concerned, and Elena was grateful for the fact of him, his steady presence and his practical hands, and the way he held her hand through the hardest parts without saying anything, which was exactly right. The baby was healthy and very loud from the first moment, which Mrs. Alvarez said was an excellent sign, and which Dollar's Rays confirmed with the authority of a woman who had attended a great many births. They named him Thomas, after Jessie's father, with the middle name Raphael after Elena's. Thomas Raphael Cole arrived in the world with dark hair like his mother and his grandfather's eyes, and he was from his first weeks a person of considerable opinions, most of them about food and sleep, which was fair enough. That evening, after the house was quiet and Thomas was sleeping and Elena was resting, and Mrs. Alvarez had finally, under considerable persuasion, gone home for the night, Jessie sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and his mother's pattern book open on the table in front of him, not reading it exactly but simply having it there, the way you have a thing when you want to feel close to someone. He thought about his mother in the winter of 1871, sitting by a fire in Texas with her needle and her thread, making the cathedral windows quilt for Caleb. He thought about all the years that had passed and all the miles the quilt had traveled, and how it had ended up folded over a broomstick in Caldera Springs, where he had stopped and seen it and crossed the street without fully deciding to. He thought about Elena standing at that market table with the ink smudge on her hand, asking if he was interested in the quilt. He thought about what it meant, that things connected the way they did. He didn't have a theology about it. He was not a man much given to theology. But he believed in attention, and in following the thing that your attention was drawn to, and in trusting that some arrivals, however strange their paths, were the right arrivals. The quilt was on the back of their bedroom door now, because Elena had hung it there the day they came home from the wedding and neither of them had seen any reason to move it. It was not a preserved thing or a museum thing. It was a used thing, a lived-with thing, which was what his mother had made it to be. Thomas grew up with the quilt as part of the texture of home, the way children absorb the context they are given. He grew up also with his mother's studio and his father's land and the particular education of a child, raised in a place where craft and labor and beauty were treated as things of equal value. He had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and the specific stubbornness that seemed to emerge from the combination of the two, which kept both his parents busy. In the spring of 1887, Elena became pregnant again, and this time it was a girl, born in November, healthy and loud in the manner that the Cole children apparently considered appropriate. They named her Margaret after Jesse's mother, with the middle name Dolors for the old woman who had watched Elena's market table on the afternoon that everything had begun, and who was, by this point, as close to family as anyone not born into the thing could be. Margaret grew up to have her grandmother's eye for pattern and her mother's stubbornness and her father's quiet intensity, which was a combination that would, in later years, make her both very successful and very exhausting to negotiate with. But that was later. In the autumn of 1887, Garrett made one final attempt to cause trouble, appearing in Caldera Springs with a new set of claims about money owed, and trying to enlist the sympathy of the county clerk, who happened to be a man he knew. Jesse heard about it from the sheriff, a pragmatic man named Ortega who had no patience for manufactured grievances, and Jesse made a trip to Las Cruces to see Whitfield the lawyer, who had kept his notes from 1882 carefully and was able to produce documentation of the original harassment in short order. Garrett's claims were assessed and dismissed. He did not return after that. Elena heard about the resolution from Jesse on a Tuesday evening, the children already in bed, the house quiet around the fire. She listened to the whole account without interruption. Then she said, "Good," with a completeness that closed the subject entirely, and she went back to the sketch she was working on. Jesse watched her for a moment. 5 years of marriage had not made the watching ordinary. He suspected, privately and without any of the doubt he would have brought to the suspicion 5 years earlier, that it never would. "Elena," he said. She looked up. "I'm glad you were at that market table." She looked at him with the full force of the real face she now almost always wore for him, the open one. "So am I," she said, and then with the particular quality of warmth she had learned over the years to let show, "I'm glad your mother made that quilt." He nodded. He looked at the fire. He thought of his mother at her needle, creating something with her hands that would outlast her and travel further than she could have imagined and eventually do something she would have wanted done, which was to bring her son home to somewhere that felt like home. Outside, the autumn wind moved across the land the way it always did, coming down off the mesa in long, cold sweeps. The cattle were settled in the south pasture. The horses were in the barn. The stone building that was Elena's studio stood 100 yards away with its dark windows, and the work inside it, the tiles in progress, the sketches pinned to the wall, the half-finished painting of the mountains that Elena had been working on since August. The house was warm and full of the sounds of a house that people actually live in, the small sounds of children sleeping upstairs and fire settling in the grate, and the particular breathing of two people at ease in the same room. On the shelf above the kitchen table, next to the carved wooden Santo from Santa Fe and his mother's cedar box with the pattern book inside, was a small painted tile that showed the view from the kitchen window, the particular angle of the land as it stretched toward the horizon, done in colors so accurate they made a person stop breathing for a second. And on the back of the bedroom door, as it had been for nearly 5 years, hung his mother's cathedral windows quilt, its burgundy and gold and sky and winter blue still vivid, still precise, still the best work she had ever done. Thomas would inherit it eventually. He would ask about it one day, in the direct way he asked about everything, standing at the bedroom door and touching the fabric with his small, serious hands, wanting to know who made it and why and where it came from. And Jesse would tell him the whole story, all of it, from the beginning, from the moment he had stopped cold in the middle of a dusty street in September of 1882 and seen something familiar in something lost. He would tell Thomas about Margaret Cole and her needle and her thread, and the winter of 1871. He would tell him about Caleb, and about the long, strange journey of a quilt through years and miles and several sets of hands. He would tell him about a market table and a woman with an ink smudge on her hand and eyes that looked at things straight on. He would tell him about flour and salt and rope, which were the three things he had ridden into town for that Tuesday, and the fourth thing he had found without looking for it. Thomas would listen to all of this with his small, serious face, and then he would touch the quilt again and say, in the grave way he said important things, "So the quilt brought you to Mama." And Jesse would think about this for a moment, the way he thought about important things. "The quilt showed me where to look," he would say. "The rest was us." Thomas would consider this. He would look at the quilt one more time, at the colors and the pattern, the cathedral windows his grandmother had cut and sewn with such meticulous care through a Texas winter more than 20 years before. Then he would nod, satisfied, and go back to whatever he had been doing before the question had occurred to him, the way children do when they have received an answer that is sufficient. And in the kitchen, Elena would be at the table with her breakfast, or at the window watching the morning come across the land, or she would be calling to Jesse about something practical and necessary, something about the horses or the fire or what he wanted for supper. And Jesse would come to her, or she would come to him, and they would stand in the kitchen of the house he had built and she had made into a home, and outside the stone building would wait with its north window and its light and its tile and paint and paper, and all the beauty she kept making out of the particular colors of the land she had decided not to leave. The quilt hung on the door and the pattern book sat in its cedar box and the mountains were blue on the horizon, and the children grew and the herd grew and the studio work grew, and the life they had built together accumulated, year by year, the specific weight of a life that is genuinely good. It was not a life without difficulty. There were hard seasons and sick cattle and the inevitable grinding friction of two very direct people sharing a small house, and the territorial politics that made certain things harder than they needed to be, and the ordinary losses that come to everyone. Dollar's raise in 1889, gentle and well-loved, and Mrs. Alvarez's husband the following year, and the weight of those losses carried the way all grief is carried, incorporated and endured. But it was, in the ways that counted most, a life of abundance, not the abundance of wealth, though they were comfortable enough, the abundance of meaning, the abundance of knowing what mattered and having it close. On a September evening in 1890, 8 years after Jesse had stopped cold in a dusty street and seen a quilt that should not have been there, he and Elena sat on the porch of their ranch house and watched the sun go down over the mesa in the extravagant way it went down in September, all orange and rose, and the particular deep gold that Elena had never been able to quite capture in paint, though she kept trying. Thomas was 8 years old and asleep upstairs. Margaret was 2 and had been asleep since before the sun went down. The ranch was quiet in the way it got quiet in the evenings, settled and content. Elena had the quilt over her lap against the evening chill, not because she was very cold but because she liked the weight of it. Jesse looked at her, at the quilt on her lap and the evening light on her face and the mountains in the distance. He thought about coincidence and about attention, and about the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of a life that had arrived at exactly where it needed to be through a route that no one could have planned. "Happy," he said. She looked at him with the real face, the open one, the one that was entirely for him. "Yes," she said, "completely." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side and they watched the last light leave the mesa and the first stars appear above it, clear and brilliant in the way of high desert stars, extravagant and permanent. The quilt was warm across their laps. His mother's colors in the dark, burgundy and gold and the sky in winter blue. All of it finally, exactly where it belonged.